Okay, so I figured that I'd do a review over some of the books that I've read in the stack here. Uh, f- I should probably mention that the majority of the books I read are ebooks. They're online, or I download them. That's just because that I move around a lot, so it's very unpractical for me to actually buy physical books because I have to then, figure out a way to move them and ship them and do all this and that. So the most of the books that I actually have that are like physical are on this desk right here. It's not all of them, but it's the majority of it. So I'm just gonna go through them one at a time and just talk about them uh, shortly. So first on the list here, or first on the stack, on Grand Strategy by John Lewis Gaddis. John Lewis Gaddis is known as the Dean of Cold War history, but this book that he wrote here is not on the Cold War. It's on, as the title suggests, Grand Strategy. I've read this book twice, and the first time I didn't quite understand it. I mean, I did enjoy it, but there was certain concepts and things that just didn't click for me at the time. And when I came back and reread it, it all made sense for me. I think I read it reread it 2 years after I initially read it. And all I can say is that it's a mix of history, philosophy, and like ancient wisdom. If you're looking for technical stuff on grand strategy, you're not gonna find it, because strategy itself, which the book does talk about at length here and there, is not so much about the technical aspects of like logistics or operations or tactics, how they interrelate. It goes far more beyond that. And this book isn't about theory either. It is more on philosophy and wisdom as well, which you won't find modern books to really talk about these days. It's not the in thing these days, especially in the realm of academia and publishing. It always has to be scientific. You got to have the numbers, you got to have the statistics, this, that, and the other. Everything has to be distilled down and critically analyzed and deconstructed. But this book is it's not like that at all. It's written in like a more older kind of prose. Probably not the exact kind of words that best describes it there, but I'm just going off the top of my head right now. So these are the chapters. If you're just looking at it from a new person's perspective onto this topic, probably a lot of them don't really make sense to you. But John Lewis Gaddis goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, to the Civil War, and a couple of modern day equivalents regarding strategy and strategists in this book. But that's not the core focus of it. It's not a history book itself. It is, as the title says, on grand strategy. I do highly recommend reading this. It was very enlightening. Yeah. So put that there. On to the next one. Yes, Guderian himself. So this is like a handbook for tank operations. And what's interesting about this book is that you can see the thought process of this man right here on the development of tactics and operations of using tanks. I actually haven't finished reading the book. What I did was that I read the developmental parts. So I read this part here, the beginning, the implementation during the First World War, and then the end. There was a chapter, well, not really a chapter, it was only like 2 pages here, armored and motorized reconnaissance. This was like really interesting. The use of mechanized recon units as part of the tank division, or tank operations, should I say. That was very interesting part. But this part here, these chapters, I didn't quite read it. I skimmed over it, just because it was like super technical. So if you want a source for studying German armored warfare just prior to the Second World War and the early use of tanks, this book is pretty good. You can find a lot of information here, sorry. But what I found most interesting and most useful was, as I said, the beginning part here, because here he talks about the developments in the First World War and then the developments of the tanks and how they were used tactically and operationally and all of the problems that went into that, not just in terms of tactics and operations, but also strategically. Like if you have a new weapon, what is the best way to deploy it? And he points out here all of the mistakes that were made by the British when they deployed their tanks, and what the Germans could learn from it, because he analyzed it, and then you read in this book all his thoughts on that. And like, in terms of tank commanders in the German armed forces, Guderian is regarded as one of the good ones. So yeah, Achtung Panzer. Would I recommend it? If you're into tanks and stuff, then yes, I would definitely recommend it. If you're someone like me who's more interested in like the philosophical and the theoretical aspects and like learning the how and why aspects more than like the what and when, then this book definitely is up there to have a look at. Now moving on, we have the other tank commander, but this isn't about tanks. This is Infantry Attacks by Rommel. Not a lot of people know that Rommel was known as a very successful light infantry commander, and this book right here is basically his memoirs, kind of. I read this when I was 15, I think, and this book quite literally did change my life, and not for the reasons that you would think of, because if you're 15 and you read a book like this, and you've never known anything about combat, like to this day, I still haven't actually like seen like a real firearm, let alone touch one or fire one. But that's because of where I come from. Guns are not a thing, and the conduct of warfare and military life is very, very distant from my culture, my family, and where I live. It's not a norm. For like Westerners and especially Americans, they don't quite realize, because how could they? I'm a foreigner looking towards their society and country. If they're within their own culture, they can't really reflect and see upon. But Americans have a very, very militarized culture. It's kind of hard to explain in one video. But someone like me to read this book, did change my outlook and perspective on things, because this is the first book where I got a glimpse into what it meant to be a military commander. Because around about this time when you're 15, at least for me, my concept of like military commanders is like, stuff you get from Hollywood, where it's just the dude, he says some like really cool or like really, has this bravado speech and whatnot, and then everyone just follows him into the guns blazing, all that. But here, in this book, you get to see firsthand the development of someone's ability to think critically in times of crisis and then act upon it. I don't think that what today the military would call like the military decision-making process. I know there is like a codified document. Not a codified document, but there is a codified doctrine of how modern military personnel go about operations. It's like a 7-step process of some kind. This book, obviously, because it was the First World War, these guys didn't have such kind of codified things. And in this book here, you get to see Rommel's development of his decision-making process. And in this book, he basically has records of every major engagement that he took part in. So you have here the opening battles of the First World War, and a lot of people don't know, but the first few operations of the First World War on the Western Front, they were largely battles of maneuvers. It was this massive operations involving whole divisions of infantry, and they were maneuvering basically. The trench warfare hadn't quite set in just yet for the beginning, and the Germans did get quite close to Paris at one point, and then that resulted in the Battle of the Marne. But Rommel was there for the opening engagements, and it was like what we would see today as, battles of maneuver, where everyone's like conducting reconnaissance, finding out where the enemy weak points are, and then maneuvering as fast as they possibly could to try outflank and suppress and this, that, the other. And then after that, the trench warfare takes foothold. And Rommel doesn't see any more action in the Western Front for that part, for the trench warfare, because he gets wounded in action. So the first part here, it's all super small unit actions. And that's the other interesting thing about this book, is that you get to follow Rommel's career throughout the First World War, from being a small unit commander until he becomes, I think it was a battalion commander or a company commander. And towards the end here, he's commanding like really, really large infantry formations in combat. And yeah, you get to see through this entire book almost every engagement, and it's basically just a book of after action reports. It's interesting because the language that he uses is not dry. It's not dry like some other books here that I'm gonna talk about, because it's more of like from a memoirs perspective, but at the same time it's super analytical. And if I remember correctly, what Rommel did was that he came back to all of the battlefields that he fought on when he was writing this book, so that he could go back and make drawings like these. Diagrams like these are throughout the entire book, so which is like really, really good, because most military history books, when they talk about tactics and operations, they don't provide maps like these very often. It's usually like a couple of maps at the beginning or in the middle of the book publication, depending on who published the book. But throughout this book that he writes, throughout every major engagement, if there was something that he's describing, he would draw out these maps here. And you get to see, basically, they put the words with the pictures, and then things make sense. Usually, if I'm reading like a more contemporary book, I don't have one here though. There was a book that was written by Anthony Beaver about the Battle of the Bulge. I had to go and like get another map so that I could follow through all the operations that he was talking about. And that's usually a common thing, that if you really want to study campaigns of books that were written about it, contemporary books, you kind of have to get your own maps and then try follow through. Or at least I do, because I have a very hard time following, trying to visualize through just pure text things that operating in 3 dimensions. For me, I have to see, and this book was great because you have all these diagrams and pictures here that Rommel drew that go hand in hand with all of the descriptions on the text here. So yeah. And if you want to study Rommel, like I haven't quite studied all of his exploits in the Second World War regarding tanks, but I do know what he's known for. And if you read this book, you can find out where he got his style of warfare, the use of reconnaissance, maneuver, outflanking the enemy, force concentration. Yeah, you get that all. You can get all of that from here. And I've only read it once. I probably should reread it again, but we'll see about that. So there's that, Infantry Attacks by Rommel. Let me put this back. Okay. All right. Moving on. Douglas MacArthur, American Warrior. Right. This I read when I was 16, and to be honest, when I got this book out of the box, I couldn't quite believe that I actually read this when I was 16, because this is like let's have a look here. It's about a 900-page book, and the text is like that. What can I say? There's another biography on MacArthur that I wanted to read. It was called Douglas MacArthur, American Caesar, or something like that. It's an older publication. This is a newer, more modern biography. And all I can say is that MacArthur is a very vain man. There's a lot of criticisms about MacArthur today, that he was a coward, dug in Bataan, Corregidor, I think, actually, in the Philippines during the opening engagements of the Pacific War. And then you have his return to the Philippines, that whole campaign, he's always criticized that it wasn't strategically important. It would have been better to just go with Nimitz and just cut across the Pacific and go straight for the Japanese mainland. I mean, strategically speaking, there were arguments for and against and all this and that, but all I can say is that he's not a stupid guy, all right? And he's not a coward. If you read through his exploits in the First World War, yeah, and also certain events during the Second World War, he's not a coward. You can't openly say that this man was a coward, because this dude was there getting shot at just with everybody else, and this was a very common occurrence. But he'd be in a position where there were shooting and bullets flying all around him, and he just walked right through it, and everyone and people were there. Well, actually, no, not to say that people were there. Usually, the people that were around him all were just dropping dead. And I remember there was an account here in the First World War where he's leading an attack against machine gun nests, and he's going at them with just I don't think he was even armed at the time. And a shell lands like right next to him. He gets off unscathed, but everyone around him is dead. Like his entire command staff is like all gone. Of course, at that time, he wasn't like a high-ranking. Well, actually, I think he was. I think he was like a colonel or about to be a general or something like that. And it may not have been his command staff. It might have been just whatever unit he attached himself to when they were making the attack. Yeah, they all ended up dead. And this is a very common thing that happens with MacArthur. He's always in the position where he's getting shot at and everyone around him is dying, but he just like walks right through it. So no, he's not a coward, and he's not stupid in the sense that he lacks intelligence. You don't become a 5-star general by being an idiot. That's not how it works. But he is an extremely vain man. There's no doubt about that. And when you read about other people's opinions about him and around, and of course in this biography you can find the biographer doesn't quite hold back here regarding all of the vain things that he does throughout his career. Was he a great man? In my opinion, compared to everybody else that fought in the Second World War, I don't think so. I really don't think so. But I, at the same time, as I said just now, don't quite agree with the major criticisms, the contemporary criticisms about him being stupid or being a coward. Those things aren't true. Like you can be brave and smart and yet do incredibly dumb things, right? Especially like comments to his subordinate commanders when they pulled out of the Philippines. I think that was like the problem when Wainwright, the general that takes over once MacArthur gets recalled from the Philippines, and then he gets captured by the Japanese. There's like instances and comments that are made that, you know, like why are you doing that, man? Like that's not what a good leader is supposed to do. You don't blame other people for like all the things that went wrong that happened under your command. That's not how it should go. But yeah, it is what it is. I tell you what though, his best achievements were not on the battlefield. It was the post-war, the handling of the occupation of Japan, and then the invasion at Incheon. And then, of course, after that, it just gone downhill. Invasion of Incheon, you could probably still argue it was more like a gamble instead of like a genius strategic move. I haven't quite studied very well into it. If I recall, because it's been 10 years since I read this book, the biographer is quite even-handed on that. I think he gives praise on MacArthur for thinking about it and then planning the operation for Incheon. But it was the occupation of Japan that probably was no other man on earth who could have properly taken post-war Japan into integrating into Western ideals and then setting it up for the country that it is today. Yeah, probably no other man than MacArthur could have done that. The interesting thing that I found was that I think his father was the far greater man, because his father was a Medal of Honor recipient during the Civil War. And both MacArthur and his father, who I think I had the same name, if I'm not, if I'm correct, if I remember correctly, Arthur MacArthur, that's his name, his father's name, they both are well versed in Oriental society. I think his father actually was fluent in Mandarin. I might be remembering it incorrectly here, but MacArthur was very well versed in matters of the Far East, especially with China. And that was a part that I was like amazed with, that there were Americans back then who, you know, were not ignorant and were very well read and versed in Far Eastern and Oriental matters. And yeah, I think I'm going to return to the early chapters regarding that, and both his father and him, what their thoughts were on foreign relations and military matters from a Western perspective, looking to the Orient. So, yep, we'll put that there. Moving on. I think I'll just go through one of the stacks today, and then I'll go through the other stack another time. James Holland, The Battle of Budin. When I first started reading this book, I was very disappointed, just because the first half, and I mean like the actual first half of the book, is on the Battle of France. And as I was reading it, I was like, well, where's the deployment of fighters and doubting and this, that, and the other. By the time I finished the book, however, I was very thoroughly happy with reading the whole thing. And James Holland is correct in how he wrote the book, that you do have to start with the Battle of France, because the Battle of Britain is a strategic air campaign at its core. And strategic battles, especially strategic air battles, you can't just start with when the first air raid begins. You have to go back all the way to the development of all the weapons and all the systems. And in this case here, it's everything from radar to the command and control systems to the fighters themselves, to planes, the operations and tactics that were limited by the technology at the time, what they can, what they can't do, and of course the politics that inform the strategy on both sides, how those all get played. These all need to be analyzed and read in order to fully understand a strategic air campaign. And this book is as comprehensive as it gets. You have the perspectives of everyone from senior military commanders all the way to the fighter pilots and everything in between. Definitely recommend this book if you want to study strategic air power. And the Battle of Britain is always like sidelined in terms of strategic bombing, because when it comes to like strategic air power and strategic bombing, everyone just starts with the Americans when they arrive in 1942, and then the 8th Army Air Force, the Mighty 8th, and then after that, they then focus on British night bombing, and then, of course, finally with the firebombing campaigns in Japan. But this one here, and especially the Germans' very early air campaigns against their neighboring countries and the low countries in Europe, these all are usually overlooked when it comes to like the strategic analysis of air power in history. I would definitely recommend you start here first if you want to study strategic air power, the Battle of Britain. So there's that. Now we get into some old school stuff. Old school. Campaigns of Alexander by Arrian. Arrian was a Roman, if I recall correctly. I might be wrong on that. What? All I know is that the dude who wrote this wasn't there when it happened. He wrote the book several hundred years after the fact. And this is a common theme, right? Is that in modern academia, the classics are completely overlooked now. In fact, in some cases, it's like, how do I put in the words about the classics in academia? They are purposefully put aside, ignored. They are purposefully ignored because the way that the humanities in the universities today is treated, they are treated as if they are a science. Hence, social sciences, I suppose. I know that Richard Feynman, this interview of Richard Feynman on YouTube where he talks about like his thoughts on social sciences and the application of scientific theory because of the amount of success science has had over the last few hundred years. People are trying to shoehorn it into everything that they do, and hence why modern academics, when it comes to history, philosophy, theory, and of course, in this case, military history, I've talked about it before in a few videos where I'm going to repeat myself here. It doesn't work. You can't scientifically codify things that are fundamentally human phenomenon. The human experience is not scientific. We we are creatures that are capable of being rational. We are not rational beings, if that makes sense. There's nuance to that. And books like these, because you can critically deconstruct and analyze that, okay, the guy wasn't there, how can we trust this book for anything that's written? And the same goes for like Thucydides or Herodotus or any of the ancient Greeks writers, philosophers, thinkers, historians. They're all sidelined now because they weren't scientific. But from my point of view, like, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. Just because they didn't have proper citations or codified sources does not mean that whatever it was that they wrote can be discarded because it's not scientific. There is ancient wisdom to be found that is of great practical importance to modern life, and especially in my experience studying military history. Just because some dude did something 2,000 years ago in a time where he didn't have technology like computers or the internet does not mean that his ideas are to be forfeited when it comes to modern warfare and strategy. If you're looking at the technical details, then yes, in like the use of weapons and whatnot, I don't think you're going to find much overlap between using a spear and firing an anti-tank guided missile. But in terms of strategy, politics, philosophy, these things are timeless. And these things carry on. These things don't change, really. It's like the Fallout quote, war never changes. What changes is like the aesthetics, the outside appearance of warfare. That does change. Every now and then you are going to have a revolution of some kind in terms of technology. But at the core fundamentals of warfare and military principles, they have remained the same throughout all of recorded human history. That cannot be denied. So, Campaigns of Alexander by Arrian. I really enjoyed the book. And there is descriptions of battles and the author's thoughts on Alexander's tactics and operations that you can learn quite a lot from here. I am currently conducting research into the development of the Macedonian art of war and how they handled their command and control and how they coordinated to execute complex maneuvers on a battlefield when you had, basically no real, what we would consider by today's standards, no real form of communication, effective communications. But they had systems and tools that, by modern standards, obviously, we wouldn't consider them to even be systems or tools, but it was for them and they managed to make it work. So I'm doing more research into that. Campaigns of Alexander. You've got the descriptions of the Battle of Issus and Gaugamela all in here. Very good stuff. Moving on, we have another classic, Persian expedition, or sometimes known as Anabasis by Xenophon. Now this was interesting because the whole campaign, just when I read it, it read like something out of science fiction, basically. If I were to describe what this campaign is, it's basically Battlestar Galactica, but the real life version. That's what happened. Like, I don't think there was another way I could put it like that. You have an army of about 10,000 dudes. Well, the way that contemporary revisions have been, it probably was more like 13,000, I think, was the latest estimate. But they rounded it down to 10,000 because it just sounds better. I think that was like one interpretation of something, new research that came out. But we'll just go with the mainstream narrative here. The Persian expedition, an army of 10,000 Greeks gets stranded behind enemy lines in Persia. And they basically have to fight their way out through miles. They have to cross the entire, Persian, I'm not entirely sure what the geographical name is, but they are very deep behind enemy lines and they have to fight their way out to get back to Greece. And along the way, they have to handle the internal politics and drama of the different Greek contingents in that army of 10,000. So they have to come up with a political system on the fly. And then as they're progressing through their campaign, they have to adapt their weapons and tactics along the way. It's basically a roguelike campaign version. If I were to use the gaming terms, that's what this this campaign is. It's FTL but real life with 10,000 dudes, and yeah, it was one hell of a campaign and one hell of a story as well. And it was what I found interesting was like the on-the-fly developments of the tactics and weapons as they're going through the campaign. I remember there's a unit of skirmishers, part of their army, that they have to switch weapons to, I can't remember, I think they were using slings and then they switched over to bows, or it might have been the other way around. But they had to acquire weapons from the enemies that they were fighting in Persia at the time, because they were getting outranged by enemy skirmishers. So they had to adapt there and then if they were going to survive to make it back to Greece. That was one part of the campaign that I remember that was like really cool. And there's like many similar instances throughout this campaign where things like that happen. Yeah, this was an amazing book, because I had never heard of this campaign before, and I don't think a lot of people ever know that such a campaign actually took place and happened. Yeah, real life Battlestar Galactica. All right, moving on. Sabers through the Reich. Right, this was great. Now, this book is a book on American Second World War mechanized cavalry operations. Yeah, that basically sums it up. It's not the only book on US mechanized cavalry. There was quite a few other books that have been written on the development of US mechanized cavalry tactics and operations in the Second World War. But what this book does that makes it unique is that the author here, who is a armored cavalry officer, well, retired, I believe. Let me get my notes out of here. He compiled all of the operations after action reports of Second World War Cavalry Corps of the US military, and he put it into one book. So if we just open up the chapters here. Okay, so the first two chapters here is purely the development of the mechanized cavalry, how they were transitioning from horses to tanks and half tracks and this, that, and the other. And at the very end here, you have the conclusions of what this arm of the army was capable of doing, what they actually did, and how much they contributed to the final defeat of Nazi Germany in the Second World War. So if you want to just get a broad overview, overlook of the development of mechanization, and then see how they operated, you only really need to read the first two chapters and the last chapter for that. But the rest of the book here is very, very dry writing, but you know, I don't think it could be a criticism because it is purely operations. Now, the thing about cavalry operations is that it's usually smaller units, because the point of the cavalry is reconnaissance, intelligence, screening the flanks, and then economy of force. So by default, when an engagement does occur, it's not going to be an entire division that's going to be deployed to engage the enemy. It's going to come down to smaller units. They're going to have to face off against much larger units, especially if the enemy is attacking. It's up to the cavalry to be the first line of defense on the flanks until the main armor and infantry divisions get to be redeployed to fight the battle. Yeah, you get all of that. You get all of that in this book. Almost every major operation that the mechanized cavalry took part in, you have it all here. And you get quite a few maps like this. Compared to Rommel's book, there's not as many and it's not as detailed maps of operations for the US mechanized cavalry. But the descriptions here is very, very detailed. And of course, it's by default very dry. But there are certain stories that occur throughout the book here that the author writes down and makes special mention of. I believe there was an engagement here where a M8 Greyhound goes up against a Tiger tank and wins at point blank range. They have a little tank duel, and instances like that, stories of where cavalry is completely outnumbered and outgunned, but they manage to pull off some really, really insane holding actions, or they face off against German attackers in battles that they're completely outnumbered and outgunned, but still manage to either stall, stalemate, or in some cases overcome the odds. You get all of that here. Yes, it is a very, very good book. I quite enjoyed reading that. Okay, moving on. Dragons and the Snake. So David Kilcullen, he has written, I think, 2 other books about counterinsurgency. This book itself is not purely on counterinsurgency. It's basically the strategic, at the very end, last few chapters, the philosophical analysis of the dichotomy between Western and non-Western ways of fighting in the modern age. This is contemporary strategy. If we, let me see, no, it wasn't. You have here, he kind of splits it into 2 different types of battles, quote unquote battles, that goes on. Obviously, the first part is regarding counterinsurgency, how Western militaries have to fight counterinsurgency campaigns against Islamic terrorists or any other kind of like small unit. Well, that's not correct term, small unit, but counterinsurgency, right? Fighting terrorists and that. And then, of course, on the other hand, you have the what the Americans consider to be the China threat. How what we would consider in modern terms contemporary military forces that are trying to be peer on peer to fight the Americans, how they have adapted. And he goes, talks about Desert Storm and how that that impacted not only how the Americans have been conducting warfare since 91, but also what that did to all of America's enemies. Because everyone, when they looked at Desert Storm, they learned lessons from that battle, that campaign. And you can see it reflected here. Analysis. We'll take China for the main example here for the second part. How the Chinese have adapted their strategy and their logistics and their operations to try and level the playing field. Because everyone knows that if you try to fight the Americans one-on-one in open battle, you're going to die. So you can't afford to do that anymore. And in this book here, he very accurately summarizes all of the ways that the enemies of the West have adapted strategies that have made them capable of standing toe-to-toe with the U.S. military, and in some cases, coming out on top. And the final parts of this book is basically like a warning to say that if these trends like continue the way they are, there is a very real chance that the West will end up losing its military prowess, basically. Yes, the West probably still, for the next few decades, if you're in an open battle, one-on-one, they're probably still going to just wipe the floor. But warfare is changing in such a way that there are other ways to fight. And as I mentioned before in other videos regarding the differences between Eastern and Western philosophy, especially military philosophy, it's been going on for thousands of years. There's always been a very distinct cultural dynamic between Western and Eastern ways of fighting, or the ways that people from both ends of the earth, how they approach warfare. And we are probably getting to the point where this dynamic is beginning to change. The West has dominated military affairs for centuries at this point, but we may be getting to the point where things are going to switch up here. An interesting case study that he brings up is the fall of the Roman Empire, which you wouldn't think you were going to get that from this book, but he does bring up the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire after the fall of Rome. The Byzantines, they face the same similar situation as the West is. Well, we'll use America for this example here. He brings up the similarities from the strategic point of view, that the Americans are coming to the point where they're in a very similar strategic situation to the Romans at the fall of the Roman Empire. And he brings up how the Byzantines were able to sustain their culture, their identity, and their military dominance for almost 1,000 years, longer after the fall. And he goes in depth of how modern contemporary armies are going to have to adopt weapons and tactics of their enemies. In this case here, the dynamic between the East and West. The Byzantines, they were capable of reorganizing their army. the military units adopting different weapons, different tactics, and then using that in conjunction with what they had prior during the height of the Roman Empire, using their strengths there, combining it together to fight a different way. Yes, so basically this book here, if you want some things to think about regarding military development and philosophy and more niche aspects of warfare, very good book to read. I'll probably revisit that book soon. But yeah, okay, so the last book in this stack, Shattered Sword, the go-to book for the Battle of Midway. Now, I've mentioned before in another video, and I'll repeat myself here, I wouldn't recommend reading this book as the first book if you want to study the Battle of Midway. That is because Shattered Sword gives the Japanese side. Well, okay, that's not entirely true. Shattered Sword is known as the book to read on Midway because, like the majority of the Pacific War, the history has been written by the Americans. I didn't actually know this at the time when I read it, and I only figured it out after. But the majority of the history of the Pacific War is written by the Americans for mainly two reasons. One, all of the archival sources for the Japanese conduct of operation, tactics, and strategy, a lot of these documents basically got firebombed out of existence during the final air campaigns. The other part of that story is that it's all in Japanese, obviously. So there hasn't been that much of an effort or attempt to go into the remaining archival sources of Japanese operations, tactics, and strategy in the Second World War, and then translating it and then analyzing it. This book does that for the Battle of Midway. And what this book does, it dispels some quote-unquote myths about the Battle of Midway. So it is the definitive book to go to get the whole story of the Battle of Midway. But if you are brand new to studying campaigns and battles, I wouldn't recommend you start with this book first. I recommend you start with one of the more quote-unquote traditional books on the matter. The book that I read was Miracle at Midway. I can't remember who wrote it. That was an interesting book because it gave both sides. But it gave both sides without actually knowing the Japanese side. They didn't have access at the time. It was written to the knowledge that is here in Shattered Sword. So you can see how military historiography takes place. If you read Miracle at Midway and then read this book, you not only learn basically all the perspectives of the Battle of Midway, but you also get to see firsthand how history develops, historiography, the history of history, basically the metagaming of history. Yeah, it's an interesting exercise to go through. Shattered Sword. You get a lot of information regarding Japanese carrier operations and strategy and the development and the differences between Japanese and the Americans during the early part of the war. The Americans, because I'm doing covering research into fighter tactics and doctrine, and originally this research that I was doing was supposed to be focused purely on American naval aviation in the Second World War, but it expanded and got a little bit out of hand. But the Americans go through a lot, and I mean a lot, of developmental changes in carrier warfare in the Second World War alone. From the beginning to the end, from 1942 to 45, they go through a lot of changes of the way they fight using carriers. I won't go into full details in this video here because this video has already gone on long enough. But yeah, that's the last book in this stack. I'll make another video going through the other stack. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed this video and would like more, please like and subscribe. So yeah, thanks.